Under the yellowish light of an afternoon that seemed unwilling to move forward, Lucia Herrera sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped together, her gaze fixed on the wooden floor. The apartment was small and silent, smelling of cold coffee. Javier, sitting across from her, believed he understood everything, the sadness in her eyes, the slight tremor in her breathing, the incomplete story she had told him over the course of weeks. He was convinced that Lucia was alone in the world, abandoned to her fate by a past no one had wanted to claim. Lucia was 30, 2 years old, with a life made up of fragments. She had arrived in the city 3 years earlier with a borrowed suitcase and a resume full of gaps. She never spoke about her family. When Javier asked, she smiled that closing smile, and said, "There's no one." With his protective instinct, he had accepted that answer as a painful truth. He believed that loving Lucia meant becoming the only refuge she would ever have. Javier met her in the neighborhood library on a rainy afternoon when both reached for the same book. She apologized, he insisted on letting her have it, and that was how a shy conversation began, one that grew with the passing days. He was an architect, divorced, accustomed to planning solid structures, so he wouldn't feel his own life collapsing. Lucia, on the other hand, seemed to live constantly on the edge of silence, as if every word were a risk. Over time, Lucia moved into Javier's apartment. It wasn't a planned decision, but rather the sum of long nights and half-whispered confidences. He convinced himself that he was saving her. She accepted that protection with gratitude, but also with a guilt that tightened her chest. There were things she didn't say, things she believed were buried. That afternoon, however, something was different. Lucia had spent the day restless, checking her phone, getting up and sitting down for no clear reason. Javier attributed it to a job interview that hadn't gone well. He made coffee, tried to joke, but the air was charged with an unfamiliar tension. "Lucia," he finally said, "you can trust me. You don't have to face everything alone." She looked up for the first time. Her eyes were wet. "Javier, there are things you don't know," she whispered, "things I never told you." Before she could continue, a sharp knock echoed at the door. Both of them startled. Javier frowned. They weren't expecting anyone. Lucia went pale. That ordinary sound struck her like an ancient thunderclap. "I'll get it," Javier said, already standing. Lucia wanted to stop him, but no voice came out. When the door opened, time seemed to freeze. Standing in the doorway was Roberto Herrera, tall, with carefully combed gray hair, wearing a dark coat and a gaze that had learned not to break. His eyes scanned the apartment until they landed on Lucia. For an endless second, no one spoke. "Dad," she finally said, her voice barely audible. Javier felt the world shift beneath his feet. "Father," the word collided with everything he thought he knew. Roberto stepped inside, removing his coat as if the place also belonged to him. "We've been looking for you for 3 years, he said in a deep voice, "and I find you here." Lucia stood up slowly, her hands trembling. "I told you not to look for me," she replied. "I told you I needed to disappear." Javier watched the scene without understanding. The woman he believed was alone had a father who entered with authority, with history, with a presence that filled the room. "Not look for you." Roberto shot back. "You're my daughter. You don't just disappear from a father's life like that." The silence became unbearable. Javier cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he intervened. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Lucia lives with me." Roberto looked at him for the first time, assessing him quickly. "I know," he said. "And that's why I'm here." Lucia closed her eyes. The past she thought she had left behind suddenly took a seat in her living room. Roberto sat down without being invited. He told how he had searched for her, in hospitals, in offices, across entire cities. He spoke of the night Lucia left home after an argument that changed everything. He spoke of a family broken by silences, by hard decisions, by love poorly expressed. "You didn't leave because you were alone," he said. "You left because you were hurt, and I didn't know how to listen to you." Lucia began to cry then, Without trying to stop herself, Javier, confused and aching, realized that the story he had built in his mind was only a small fragment of the truth. "I thought no one would look for me," she said through her tears. "I thought it would be easier to disappear." Roberto stood up and awkwardly embraced her. It wasn't a perfect hug, but it was real. Javier watched as something was being repaired before his eyes, and at the same time, how his role in Lucia's life was changing forever. "I didn't come to take her away," Roberto said, looking at Javier. "I came to tell her she's not alone, and to tell you that she has a home she can return to if she wishes." The tension slowly eased. They talked for hours about mistakes, fears, postponed truths. Javier listened more than he spoke. He understood that loving wasn't about rescuing, but about accompanying. When Roberto left, night had already fallen. Lucia leaned her head on Javier's shoulder. "I'm sorry for not telling you everything," she said. He looked at her with a mixture of tenderness and humility. "You weren't alone," he replied. "I just didn't know it." And in that small apartment, among traces of cold coffee and finely spoken words, everything changed. Not because someone came to save anyone, but because the truth, upon walking through the door, had put everything in its proper place.